In this video, let's start talking about doing some configuration actions for Cisco IOS. Okay, so let's start with a playbook where we are going to do configuration actions. We are going to use the Ansible core module IOS_config. We can get documentation online by just searching for Ansible IOS_config, and we can see the module documentation. Now let's look at the structure of this playbook. So here at the top, we have a play. We're going to operate on this router, PyNet router 1. This once again could be a group of routers. It could be multiple groups of routers, but here we're specifying a single device. Now here I've created a variable that I'm going to ultimately use as the provider. This is similar to things that we've seen before. Ultimately, we'd probably stuff this variable inside either host vars or group vars so it wasn't cluttering up our playbook. Now we get down to here, and the point of using IOS_facts once again is just to make sure that your connectivity is working and that we are able to connect to the device, we are able to use the provider correctly, and that we verified that part of it before we try to do something that is more complicated. We then get down here and we're going to start to do some config operations. So let's look at what I have here. I have my provider, which is telling me the IP address, the username, and the password. And then I have certain configuration lines that must be present in the config. So I'm going to set a domain name, I'm going to set some name server, I'm going to set some NTP servers. I've just hard-coded the addresses here. A little bit later we're going to move those to be some variables, but for now I've just hard-coded all of those. Now let's look at the current state of this device. So I'm just going to SSH in to a different box. I'll just use my NetMiko tools to get my current status on that device. Okay. So I'll use NetMiko grep and let me look at domain on PyNet router 1. Wait for the response of that. You can see right now I have it set to this twb-tech.com domain name. Now let me look at name server on PyNet router 1. I don't have any name servers, and I think I actually do have NTP servers configured. And there I have those two NTP servers. So I'm missing the domain name. I am going to set it to a different value. I'm missing the name servers. The NTP servers are already correct. Okay, so the lines argument is telling the configuration lines that need to be present. By default, this is going to look for global config items. I'll show you a little bit later how to make it be non-global configuration items, for example, something like interface configuration items or things inside an access list. But for now, it's going to be looking for these items inside the global config context. We'll go ahead and execute this playbook. Gathering facts. Here we're doing iOS facts that work properly. Here we say a change action occurred. Let's go back here and now look at our domain name. And then here in a second, we'll look at our name server configuration. Okay, domain name is now bogus.com, so we see that we've made a configuration change to the device. Now we're looking for the name server. We see the name server has been set. Now if I actually try to do a ping from the device, something like using a domain name, we're going to see that the ping and I did a syntax error there, we're going to see that the ping is actually going to fail because the domain lookup is not actually enabled at this point. But let's see what the response that I get back. Okay. So DNS is not enabled. We have a name servers configured, but I haven't told it to do DNS lookups on the router. Now, if we re-execute this playbook, hopefully we're going to see that it's idempotent, that it recognizes that it already has all those configuration changes done, and that it doesn't need to redo them. And in this case, it does accomplish that. Now, let's move on here, and let's make variables out of certain things here. For example, the default domain is going to be generally common in your environment, so you're probably going to have it in a variable somewhere. Same with the name servers you probably want configured. Same with the NTP servers that you probably want configured. So this is exactly the same as what we saw before, except I've moved those all to be variables. Where did I put those? I put those in group vars, and I put it in all.yaml. All.yaml is going to be a group that applies to all of the devices. So here we see the variables that I have defined for all of my devices. I have my name servers, I have my default domain, and I have my NTP servers. If I go ahead and execute this playbook, we should see that this is already properly configured because it was the same thing as what we had previously. Oh, actually it's going to change it because notice here that 8.8.3.3 is a different DNS server than what I specified earlier. In my first playbook, this was 8.8.4.4, i.e. one of Google's expected DNS servers. Here I just made something up and set it to 8.8.3.3. When I executed that playbook, you see that it executed a config change in that case. Once again, if I run it again, we'd expect there to be no additional changes. It should recognize that it has everything. Now, if I go and query the name servers at this point, we're going to see a negative artifact of doing the configuration items in this way. So here we see the two name servers that I specified in my playbook 1A. Those two exist. But now we've added a third one because the second playbook said basically this one had to be present and this one had to be present. But it doesn't know that it needs to actually remove this one. So if we wanted it to say that it needs to be these two, 8.8.8.8.8 and 8.8.3.3 and nothing else, then we'd have to do something more than what we're currently doing. Right now, all we're saying in the first playbook's case is that these two have to be present. We say nothing else about there being anything additional in the config with respect to name servers. So that's going to be a problem that ultimately we're going to have to deal with to ensure the correctness of our playbooks. Okay, so now let's go ahead and configure the IP domain lookup that was missing earlier and see if we can actually get it to execute our ping command correctly. So now if we go back here and try our ping by domain name, hopefully the ping is going to operate correctly. When we try to ping the domain, we see that it does. Now, one thing that happens here, let's actually do a search for domain, and this will show you another problem that ultimately has to be dealt with, is the IP domain lookup is actually hidden. It doesn't show up in the running config. So if we go back and look at our playbook here, if you don't actually see this just directly show up in the running config. So if I rerun this playbook, Ansible is going to think it needs to reapply that configuration command again, even though it already is configured because it's a default item. So here we're going to see we actually have a non-idempotent behavior. It constantly thinks it needs to remake this change, even though the change is already there. Okay, and this here I've just actually simplified that, what we were just showing, that basically if we keep re-executing this playbook, it'll keep trying to apply IP domain lookup. And I could rerun that if you wanted to see that, but it would behave the same way as what I just showed you. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about how you can provide the username and the password just directly from the command line. Notice here I've specified only the host. There is no username password being specified. I'm not passing it into this creds dictionary, so it's not being passed in to the provider. So in this case, if I just went and ran Ansible and tried to execute it the same way we had seen with previous playbooks, it's going to fail because it doesn't have the username and the password. And it's going to sit here and it's going to take a little bit to time out. So we'll wait for this to time out. Wait longer. And there, eventually, it gives up. It gives us this pretty generic troubleshooting message saying, unable to open shell, see this network debug troubleshooting, which generally pertains to something went wrong with the SSH connection into the device and that failed. So now, if we add the command line argument -u for the user, specify the username, which is pi class, and then -k, which is going to prompt us for the password. I then input the password because it prompted me for it, and then you see that our operation executed successfully. And there were no changes that needed to be made here, but we could modify them and actually make a change if we wanted to. Now, you could also embed these variables if you wanted to just have them already on the system but in an encrypted form, and you could embed them using Ansible Vault. We'll talk about Ansible Vault later in this course. You would still have to enter the Vault password, but you might not have to deal with individual passwords in that case, which could get to be pretty problematic. You would have one Vault password that you needed to know, and all your variable passwords for various networking devices would be inside this encrypted safe, i.e. the Vault, and then you would execute your playbook and enter your Vault password. So in this video, we've basically talked about some of the basics of doing configuration operations using the IOS _config module. We've talked about the format of it, so that we need to have this lines argument. By default, it's going to look through the global config level and try to ensure that these configuration lines exist. I've showed you how to embed some of the variables, particularly global variables, in the group vars all.yml file. Additionally, I've shown you a couple of issues that you can run into. One of those issues being that you can get into situations where you're just adding additional config lines, i.e. I showed you how we had name server 1, name server 2, name server 3, and it just added them, and it's not doing anything to remove config lines that we no longer want. I've also shown you how you can get into issues with respect to idempotency, where it thinks a given config line doesn't exist because it's a default, so it keeps trying to add it, which means that every time you run the playbook, it goes and actually makes a change even though it's in the proper state already. And then finally, I've showed you how you can pass the username and password directly from the command line.